degrees in anthropology and history from Loyola University, Chicago. She lives in Northside with her husband, posse of chickens, and hive of bees. And she's going to talk to us tonight about how to interact with local media.
Hilly, thank you so much for that introduction. Everybody, thank you so much for coming. If I can ask you to mute yourselves, we're definitely going to ask questions, but I definitely hear some background noise. And I know that we're trying to record this so that other people can listen to it afterwards who weren't able to join us this evening. Thank you so much. Hilly, I think I sent over that deck. Here we go. Awesome. Thank you. Great. Okay. Hi, everyone. So I just want to start out by saying that this is not like a full-fledged media training where we're going to sit down and record ourselves and then watch it and give ourselves self-critiques. This is really more of an exercise in thinking about how you want to own your story as an activist, an advocate, a community member, someone who might run for office someday. This is really about dipping your toes in the water, maybe doing some myth busting, and helping kind of set the stage for how you think about specifically our local media environment. So for starters, can someone here tell me about a time when they've had a positive interaction with local media? If you want to use raise your hand or drop it in the chat. Crickets. Tina, be careful, I'll call on you. No, actually, Tina, is it okay if we kick it off by using your Scarona example? Go ahead, you want it? Or Tina, whoever.
Oh, I was about to say, I think I saw Grant raise his hand. Is that right, Grant?
No, I was going to say, I don't know if it's helpful, but one of my good friends is a reporter at the Enquirer. So, I mean, that I know this isn't kind of friendly, but I'm a journalist myself. So I hope people have, I'm not local, but hope people have positive interactions with me, although I'm not reporting on the types of stuff we're talking about today. So
I will take that, Grant. I will take that. Tina, I'm actually going to cue you up here a little bit and talk about your Scarona project. But Tina had this brilliant idea to start decorating people's porches in the middle of the pandemic, late last summer, which feels like several decades ago. And Tina, you wound up with a lot of earned media coverage. So can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
The media coverage itself?
Yeah. What was it like interacting with local reporters?
Yeah, it was really surprising. I thought I would be more nervous the first few times I was. Because we started getting coverage in early May. We started it sort of mid-May, started getting coverage in May, and then by April, or what's the next month? May, June? I don't know.
June next month.
It had we were getting lots of media. We probably had 12 different, we had local, and then we had some regional news coverage. And it was fine. I'm not really sure what you, I'm a musician too, so I'm kind of used to performing a little bit. So for me, it wasn't that bad. But I also felt a little bit like I was flying by the seat of my pants and just kind of making it up. And I guess that worked, but I don't know. I'd like to I don't know. I'd like to have a little bit more something more meaningful to say. I think they always one time I think I cried because I was, it's an emotional time, and the only part of the entire thing they showed was me crying, and looking really bad on camera with bad lighting and everything. Right. Go ahead.
You have killed two birds with one stone right there, because my next question is about what does a negative experience with local media look like? And I think that you right there hit on the importance of like why we have to own our own stories, and why we have to be like fully prepared to show up and stay on message, and to feel free to not answer questions that we're not comfortable with, or like just don't know the answer to, so that we get to utilize media as a means to be our megaphone, as opposed to letting local media use us. And this is a two-way street, and it's very complicated. But there's some like really easy hacks for you to be able to make sure that next time you're on camera, you don't feel like it's a super emotional experience. Or if you do feel like it's an emotional experience, you feel empowered to say, you know what, I actually want to stop rolling for a second and let's start this over again. Because I think one of the biggest pieces about ownership of your story is that we oftentimes don't understand that we walk to the table in an interaction like that, where we're being filmed or taped, or we're being interviewed directly by someone who's doing digital or print media, that we have a lot of power and have a lot of rights here. And so my goal for all of you is to walk away feeling a little bit more empowered and a little bit more prepared to engage with local media and to understand how to do so effectively. Hilly, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, team, what's your job as an advocate? Like, have you been in a space where you've been advocating for something, either in an activist role or for an organization? Can anybody share with me like how you view your role when it comes to advocacy? What are you trying to do? Ooh, you want it. That's great. Like accurately representing your community's voice in a way that gets results. I love that. I love that. Does anybody else have any other thoughts? You can raise your hand, unmute yourself, keep your organization at the center. Yes, Amber, that's, oh, so spot on. Anybody else have thoughts? Yeah, bring awareness. To Aria, I'm sorry. Can you pronounce your name for me? I'm very sorry.
Yep, it's Tierra.
Okay, wonderful. It's beautiful. When you say to bring awareness, what do you mean?
A lot of times I feel like not with big issues, but with smaller issues, sometimes people are unaware of what's going on. And sometimes as an advocate, you're just bringing that to the forefront so people can actually see it.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic response. Thank you so much. So your role as an advocate is to understand that you have a message, and to understand that you have a responsibility to share it with the larger community in order to, as Ioana said so perfectly, to get results. And so every time you walk into a media encounter, you should be totally fine with having your own goals and your own motivations be centered there. And whether that's you serving as a spokesperson, or whether that is you even just being a person on the street in, say, like a protest situation, like it is okay for you to say, like, here's my message and I know what I want to say. Oftentimes I think that we can get into a place where we think that we just need to be in stream of consciousness mode. But your job as an advocate is to keep coming back to your message. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Hilly, can I have the next slide, please? I feel so spoiled having someone to click through for me. It's like, this is a very big deal, y'all. So we definitely have at least one other member of paid media here. But what is actually the job of journalists? What do they do? Why are they doing it? What are their motivations?
I mean, they're there to get the truth out there to the people, right?
There to get the truth out to the people. Yes, in an ideal world, that is spot on. Ioana, when you say all the clicks in caps, what do you mean by that?
Well, I guess some cynical people might say that journalists only write stories and headlines to ensure that they get the greatest number of clicks on social media, because that helps their advertisers, and then their advertisers will want to continue investing in the paper.
Yes, clicks equal money, Robert. Absolutely. So I think that this is the opportunity to wait before I do that. Does anyone else have any other thoughts about the job of journalists? What are they doing? Grant, what are your thoughts?
It's supposed to be the voice of the people accurately, right? And without being objective, ideally. At least that's how I was taught.
Yes.
Obviously, the landscape has changed so much, though, that it's clouded things because, you know, the industry is struggling by and large. So now the game has changed.
Yes. And so this is the other piece, team. As hard as your job is as an advocate to maintain the energy that you want to move your issue forward, consider that the job of a journalist in this day and age is really, really hard too. And oftentimes these are folks who have been exposed to excessive amounts of trauma by doing breaking news coverage, which is oftentimes what we think about when we say when it bleeds, it leads. They have faced like dramatic reductions in staffing structures. They have faced increasing expectations to all behave like they're broadcast journalists, which is a totally different set of muscles and skills than you learn if you go to school to be a radio journalist or a print journalist or to just do digital. These are folks who are drinking from a fire hose. Yes, and I also want to go back to the chat. Like we've got some great answers in here. And yes, like sometimes like folks are just writing a story to fill column space because someone's on vacation or someone called in sick, or like we just need to like fill up the paper and ideally not pull that from a wire service like the Associated Press or Reuters. These are all great answers. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So what I'm getting at here is that advocacy and journalism are both really challenging, and oftentimes we're facing similar challenges in terms of resources, in terms of feeling like we have to do everything for everyone and be everything for everyone, right? Like think about how exhausting advocacy and activism can be. Whether that's like a single project where suddenly you have 400 emails, like which is like kind of what happened to Tina, or whether it's like being out in the streets day in day out this summer during George Floyd protests, right? Like it wears on you, and so if it's wearing on you, it is also wearing on journalists. So I want that to kind of be like our holistic perspective here. Haley, can I have the next slide? I can't get the movie Nightcrawlers out of my head when it comes to journalism. Robert, you win for comment of the evening thus far, like, and we're only a few minutes in. So I already talked a little bit about what the intersection of these roles are and how they are similar. But when we talk about the intersection of these roles, like we actually live in an information ecosystem where whether you are a journalist who is writing day in, day out, or whether you are an advocate working for a nonprofit, or whether you're a candidate gearing up to run for office, we actually all need each other. Because you, like, regardless of how large your personal social media reach may be, and we'll talk a little bit about that, regardless of that, you don't have the megaphone of, say, WCPO and its millions of audience members, and you don't have the megaphone of Cincinnati.com and its millions of readers. When we think about where we're at, what we have the opportunity to do as advocates and activists is to utilize mainstream media and like alternative media as our megaphone in order to elevate what we're trying to do. And at the same time, there are a lot of expectations that are put on journalists that are going to make that challenging, or that maybe don't perfectly intersect with what you're trying to do. Which is why we go back to, this is about owning your story. Haley, can I have the next slide? Okay, what is your message? I know I've been saying that over and over and over again, but when you think about your interactions with local broadcast, realistically, you might do a 5-minute interview if you're doing a stand-up, which is when they pre-tape something, or whether you're doing a live shot, which is when you're actually live on air. And the same goes for radio. So you have like this very, very limited window of your language actually being able to be elevated within the context of a larger story. So if you are, say, speaking out about like a local environmental issue, you will probably be one of 3 to 4 voices. And you might have a couple of quotes up top, at the bottom of the story or in the middle, and you don't have any control over that. What you have control over is your soundbite, which is the core of your message. So that is the most critical thing to do. So I would love for everybody, if you don't already, if you've got a pen or a piece of paper handy, just like, I'm not going to make you share this. This is just for you, for self-reflection. But when you think about what you care the most about and who you represent or who you want to represent, whether that's yourself or an organization or a cause, what is like the 2-sentence takeaway that you want someone to understand about what you care about? So let's just like, just think about it. And also, if you want to drop that in the chat while you're thinking about it, like that's totally acceptable too. So you want to, I actually, while people are writing, I want to kick it over to you. The question is like, what's the 1 or 2 sentence takeaway that you want to be able to communicate about yourself or your cause or the organization that you're representing?
You want me to come up with 2 sentences?
Yeah, you want to, can you like just kind of give me what you would say Action Tank is about if I asked you on radio and I'm just doing a general interview? What would you say?
Sure. I would say Action Tank is a think tank that partners with artists to research and promote new public policy solutions at the local government level. A big part of what we do is civil society capacity building. So we train residents to pay attention to government, and we train them how to talk to government in a way that government listens, because that stuff is not intuitive. And although the opportunities might be there, if people don't know how to do it, it doesn't matter.
Heck yeah, that is really, really solid. The only thing I would change about that is to make it a little bit more concise. But that gives me a really good grounding of what Action Tank is about. So the next piece, and once more, if we can mute ourselves, that'd be great. So the next piece is like, who is your message for? Who do you need to reach? Because one of the pieces here that we oftentimes don't understand in advocacy and activism roles is who, once more, if you've got small kiddos running around, we can hear them and we're recording. So what we don't necessarily always understand is like, who are we trying to talk to? Who do you need to hear your message so that a different decision gets made, so that a different set of actions gets taken, so that like a different outcome occurs for your city or community? Like, when you start thinking about your message, does it fit into who that audience is or doesn't it? And like, that's your opportunity to really refine and think about what you're doing. And yes, friends, if we can, really, do we have the power to mute everyone? We do have the power of muting. Yes, John, you are correct. Thank you. The other piece that we need to understand is the fierce urgency of now when it comes to media deadlines. Oftentimes, people are hearing about an event that's going to take place, say like a press conference or a rally or a protest, anything along those lines. You're going to hear about that the day of or a couple of days before. And we'll talk a little bit more about how to better engage with local media on that. But your job is to explain why this is newsworthy and why that specific media outlet is going to care about your message right now. So you need to make sure that this is timely, and you need to make sure that this is relevant. Because one of the things that we can fall prey to as activists and advocates is to think like, this is all so important. And unfortunately, it is not all so important. It is not. I hate breaking this to people, but 9 times out of 10, what we're doing is not actually newsworthy, because it's not fitting in with larger current events or trends. It's not something that's revelatory. It's something where only like a handful of people are taking action, and that's not like a broader movement. Or you just aren't a known entity. Therefore, like, you aren't necessarily being taken seriously. And unfortunately, there's a lot of gatekeeping that happens in local media even more so when we start talking about regional and national media. And so that goes back to your message. I know it's a surprise, it's all going to go there. That goes back to your message. And are you representing that message on your personal channels, say Facebook or Twitter or Instagram? And are you constantly going back to them? Because chances are, if it's important enough and it's something that you care passionately enough about, that's where your messaging in terms of your personal social media should be. Like at almost all times, certainly be a human being. Don't be like a boring like churn out of press release information. But understand that you actually get to be your own advocate, and that a lot of local media outlets are making decisions on what they see in neighborhood Facebook groups and on the conversations that they see taking place on Twitter. That's really unfortunate because like less than 7% of Cincinnatians are on Twitter. It's unfortunate in that like Facebook is a terrible curator of civil discourse. We could talk about that for hours, trust me. And I'm sure a lot of us have very strong feelings about it. So that's broken, but unfortunately that's the reality in terms of how do you gather news in a 24/7 news cycle as a journalist, and how do you better understand, like how can you sift through it and use social media to sift through it more effectively? Because like on an average day, a breaking news reporter in Cincinnati is going to wake up and have between 300 and 400 emails in their inbox. That's a lot. That's the volume that regular people will encounter in their email outside of spam in a month, if not more. So yeah, it is shocking. Absolutely, John. Like, and so you as a journalist are facing this just like deluge, this fire hose of information. So make sure that when you are efforting to reach out to local media, that you're making it worth their while, because that will also increase your stock in their eyes, because they know when John sends a press release, when John sends me an email saying like story idea for Over the Rhine, North Side, Price Hill, what have you, that I should take it seriously. So it's, I think, especially in terms of like individual advocacy and as you like effort being a candidate, don't be the boy who cried wolf. Make sure that what you say truly, truly matters. And then finally, what is your call to action? What do you want to happen as a result of like media engagement and media coverage?
Can't see you, buddy.
So Tina, like for example, like for you, I see a lot of that as being like, we want more people in our neighborhood and in other neighborhoods to build like temporary public art installations on their porches and to like be able to provide a space for people to like take walking tours of their own neighborhood and rediscover it, right? Something along those lines? Yeah. So when you think about it, like your call to action can be as simple as like, we want people to sign up to do XYZ, or we want people to reconsider their actions as a consumer, or we really want City Hall to pay attention to us and like readjust their budgeting and budgeting priorities. Like any of those serves as a call to action. But if you have a message without a call to action, it winds up being really weak. And so what you want to do is build as strong of a message as is humanly possible. So that's like when you walk through that what's who, why, what, as I like to call it, you're setting yourself up for success. Hilly, can I have the next slide? All right, so you figured out your message, you figured out your audience, you figured out why it's important, and you know like what you want people to do as a result of sharing that message. So the next thing to do is to reach out to local media. They aren't always going to come to you. And oftentimes I think that we can be really shy about our activism and advocacy. Candidates, less so, let's be real. If we're running for office, like we want people to pay attention to us. It's just like how we're programmed, right? But in terms of defining next steps, first of all, you want to understand like which media outlet do I want to reach out to? Who are the reporters there who are covering these things that I care about? What have they covered recently that fits in with this? Or what are the broader trends that they're talking about in the region or in my neighborhood where this effort fits in? And so what that requires is looking around at the media landscape, doing your research, and being like reasonably genuine about interacting and engaging with journalists, both like on social media as well as like through email. And it's also about understanding that like your priority is not always going to be newsworthy, and that is okay. And one of the things that you can ask for, like much as you would if you get a rejection note from a job that you apply to, is to say like, you know what, like I totally cool that you can't cover this right now. Is there anything that I should be keeping an eye out for in my neighborhood that might be helpful to you, or in my work that might be helpful to you? Is there anything that you're really interested in covering? Because journalists are also oftentimes coming to the table with pet projects and passion projects. And Tina, I'll get to that question in a second. So understand that journalists have like a specific kind of worldview and orientation, and that is also okay. So Tina, I oftentimes think that it is good to contact like your general number of a news desk for local broadcast or radio or print. But I think that it's really important to understand that the folks on breaking news desks are sifting through hundreds of those kinds of releases every single day, and they only have a few seconds to look at each one. So you need to have a really great subject line for on your email, like story idea for neighborhood, like protest happening at XYZ at this time, residents of neighborhood asking for, new volunteer effort in neighborhood. Make it really clear what you're about, because also if you can't condense what you're trying to get across into a teaser headline, chances are it's not newsworthy. And I realize how hard that is to hear, but if you are not like thinking about what that headline can look like or what that subheadline can look like, you're not necessarily going to cause an emotional response in readers or viewers or listeners. And an emotional response is what media outlets are looking for when it comes to things like social media, which is where a lot of them are getting anywhere from 10 to 15% of their referral traffic, like their eyeballs. That means like seeing something on Facebook and clicking on it. So understand that you're in a position to help write that story, or at least that first draft of it, and like own that. It's really exciting. So spend time reading through local media coverage and look at what's getting covered and think critically about how does what I'm doing like fit into this. John, once more, you guys are asking such great questions. I really appreciate this. Thank you. In terms of finding reporters' contact information, it's usually pretty easy. So there will generally be a directory on a newsroom's website. So you can just Google like a quick Boolean search of like WCPO staff contact. If there's a specific reporter who you see on TV or on social media or here on the radio who's like talking about things that you care about, just look them up and send them an email. It is also okay to send reporters emails and be like, you know what, I really like this story. I'm excited about it. I'm also working on this. Like, what do you think about this? Like, how does this fit into what's going on in Cincinnati? Let me tell you, journalists love nothing more than procrastinating. It is literally how we are hardwired. So yeah, Grant's got a little smirk on. Yep, I see that nod. So if you get to say to your editor, like I'm really engaging with my readers or listeners, I'm like really trying to respond to their concerns on email, like chances are your editor will leave you alone because they want you to be doing that kind of work. Robert, that's a great question. A particular format to send the email. Yes, so write the headline. Spend time consuming local media and understand what kinds of headlines are being used, and think about like what the headline is when you write that subject line. And then like it can be like, if you're an activist or an advocate, it can be a more personal and less formal email, but you should put right up top what that core messaging point is, like what we talked about earlier, because that's your opportunity to say like, this is the important piece. Because unfortunately in a local media environment where there are fewer and fewer people who are full-time reporters, full-time editors, there is more and more reliance on activists and advocates to say, like, this is newsworthy. We didn't have quite as much power, say like a decade ago or 2 decades ago. But there has been more of a democratization of how we get to do storytelling in real time. So consider that when you're sending that email. Yes, like a summary, Robert, is a great way to think of it. Like think of like the who, what, where, when, why, like, and structure your top paragraph exactly like that. The other piece there is like follow local journalists on social media. Like Twitter is such a vanity metric, and let me tell you, journalists care about it so much. It's embarrassing for the industry how much we care about Twitter, and it's also one of our downfalls because it means that like a small group of very vocal people can drive the conversation in a very real way. Haley, can I have the next slide? All right. Guidelines for communication with reporters. This is like some COVID specific stuff, but also just like at all times. One, be respectful, really be respectful. Understand that like these are folks who are working ridiculous shifts, who have unreasonable expectations being placed upon them, who are humans, who once more are drinking from a fire hose of information every day. Make their job easier. Make their job easier and make their day just a little bit brighter. If you say like, hey, I really liked that story that you did last week on XYZ, I think that this fits in with that. That shows them that you're already an engaged reader and that you care about what they're doing and how they're doing it, as opposed to just being motivated by like, how do I get my message out to the biggest audience possible or to the most specific audience possible? Acknowledge what's in it for them. If you are doing a live shot or doing a recording, anything that's in person, please, for the love of all that's holy, wear a mask. I know that sounds ridiculous at this point in time, but mask compliance is all over the place in Hamilton County. Show that you are like literally respecting like their life and well-being, okay? Once more, I know that we've all just like had that beaten into us, but it cannot be said enough. Show that you're respecting their health and safety. Yes, and Grant, oh, I love it. Most journalists are getting paid a third as much as the 6 p.m. local news anchors. Friends, the median income for a journalist in Cincinnati is just above $40,000 a year. Yeah, Claire, that face that I see that you're making, yeah, that face. It's not a lot of money. It's something where people are deeply driven by passion and by like a fundamental desire to do right by communities. But that also means that sometimes people screw up really hard. Understand that the stress level that you are experiencing as a result of this pandemic and of social upheaval is being felt at a similar or greater magnitude as journalists are. It's very easy to think about journalists as automatons, but unfortunately they're not. Life might be simpler if they were. So at least part of my life would be simpler. So please, like communicate as you wish that someone would communicate with you. If you're sitting there just like shit posting and dogpiling on local journalists, like all the live long day on Twitter, when you go to send like a story idea, you're not going to be paid attention to. Like unless it's something that's enormous and breaking, you're not going to be a part of that story. And that's unfortunate. But it's also emblematic of the fact that this is a human process that is deeply reliant on relationships. And so it's okay to criticize. It's not okay to, pardon my language, be a dick. Like I just see far too much of that on local Twitter, and we can all be a lot better than that. So please communicate with respect, communicate with clarity, say exactly what you mean, and know that it's okay. Ioana proofs my emails like at least 5 times a day, and I do the same thing for her. Because like we all need a gut check and we all need an editor. So don't be afraid to run a draft by someone else before you send that out, just to check, especially if tempers are running high, or you're in the middle of a breaking news event where your health and safety is on the line as well. Hilly, can I get the next slide? All right. What's our local media landscape look like? Like if I say like 91.7 WVXU, like who do you think is their audience? Who's listening to NPR? Did you just point at me, Claire? I feel attacked by that. Really, who's the audience for VXU? What does that look like? Paint a picture. Kale eating people with master's degrees. Hi, guilty as charged. All the smart people, thinkers, people who want to be informed. Duh. Okay, yes, like you guys, but this is exactly how we break down audiences. Okay, so if I say the Cincinnati Herald, who's reading the Cincinnati Herald? Vegetarians. You meant vegetarians for WVXU, right, Ioana? Black Cincinnatians. Who else is like, what kinds of Black Cincinnatians are reading the Herald? Does anyone know? Older Black community in Cincinnati, absolutely. These are folks who are dedicated to having a print newspaper in their hands once a week, who see print as being trustworthy, and who see the Herald as representing their community interests. And so the Herald gets forgotten a lot when we talk about local media, and that is to the detriment of every single white person who interacts with the Black community. And to the detriment of every journalist who interacts with the Black community. So please, please, please keep them top of mind. When I say City Beat, what kinds of people are reading City Beat? Beatniks. Young activists, yeah. And so City Beat had college kids, people who grab them from the free boxes, absolutely. Musicians need to, yes, like in the before times, absolutely. That was like the place to go. So we're not gonna go through every hipsters, OTR people that keep the lines in all the restaurants. Amber, I really like you. I really like you. You've got good copywriting skills. So we don't need to go through all of these because we could be here like all night long, and Ioana is going to want me to wrap this up soon. But when we talk about our media landscape, each outlet actually has its own audience, and there's certainly some overlap. Cincinnati.com is going hard for WCPO's wealthy inner suburbs and inner city viewers. Cincinnati.com and WCPO and WVXU have the wealthiest and the whitest audiences. So bear that in mind. And unfortunately, when we talk about wealthy and white in this town, that oftentimes means decision makers. So those are kind of the big three in terms of how people are thinking about how they make decisions as policymakers or as authority figures, what have you. Erin, 91.7 Cincinnati.com and WCPO have the wealthiest and whitest audiences. Yes. Is there a diagram that shows degree of bias for local news? That's a great question. You know what, Robert, I have not seen that for local news. The Poynter Institute, which is based out of Tampa Bay, Florida, puts out a giant bias bell curve every year, which I will happily share. And I would be willing to noodle on that and kind of put together my perspective on it. I would say that in terms of most left-leaning, clearly City Beat, most right-leaning, it would be Local 12. I'm not sure why I put WLWTs.
700.
Oh yeah, you know what? My husband was just like waving his arms at me and said 700 WLW. So when we talk about the whitest audience and one of the largest audiences, and I am like totally guilty of this because I don't listen to radio like a lot of people do. It's an enormous audience that really dictates what the story looks like for a lot of working class white people in Cincinnati. So like, do not forget about that. And especially as you are like trying to advocate for things, consider how that audience fits in with what you're doing. Thank you, Nate, for saving this presentation. Good job. I would say that 700 WLW is definitely the furthest to the right in the local news diagram. Robert, it's such a big question. Are there certain local media that you should avoid for certain types of stories? I think that building your local media habit should partly be about like engaging with media that doesn't necessarily reflect your worldview, so you understand what other people are saying. But it should also be making sure that you're getting the news that you need to. So I would encourage you to follow local media and like make like a quick like 15-minute scroll through habit in the morning and in the evening. And like think about like what you want out of that. And then like you're gonna start to see what is and isn't being covered there. But it's so varied for so many people. Robert's asking, oh, this is so great. How much can a story change after editing? Yeah. Robert, a journalist should never promise you this is how I'm going to cover you, because that promise like cannot be kept. There will be editors, there will be producers, there will be management who get their hands on a story. So it can change pretty dramatically, which once more goes back to why you need really heavy duty message discipline. You need to just be able to go back to, I'm here because XYZ. Yeah, no pay to play either. Exactly, Grant. Thank you for bringing that up. You can see, like, especially in breaking news events, you'll watch what's usually called the main story or the live story. We call it writing through a story. And so we'll put up, a quick 2 paragraphs of like, there's a protest that's starting downtown. We're not sure what's going on here. Or like there's been a shooting. We're not sure what's going on here, but we're going to come back and like be with you all day as this develops. Like you'll hear this story's developing. And so as you go through and add details to that, that story can actually be updated time and time and time again. So bear that in mind, because like it's corny and it's a journalism trope, but like journalism is the first draft of history, which also goes back to why it's so important to know what your message is and what your motivations are and what your call to action are. And Robert, I would say in terms of preventing your words being taken out of context or the reporter only repeating your most dramatic sentence, don't be overly dramatic and know what your most important sentence is, and you keep cycling back to that. So for example, I recently put together an all volunteer project about like, let's just clear our neighborhood sidewalks and be decent to each other. That was literally the only thing that I wanted out of this, was to be able to like walk down my street uninterrupted, and for my neighbors on Chase to be able to walk down their streets uninterrupted by snow. I did a couple of live interviews with local media, and they kept going back to like, shouldn't people be responsible? And I said, you know what? This is about bringing a little bit more, oh, hi, Hilly. This is about bringing a little bit more kindness to the world, and about us seeing something that we can individually fix so that our neighborhood can be a little bit more pleasant and a little bit more accessible for pedestrians. Did I answer that question? No, I did not. Because guess what, friends? You do not have to answer the question. You don't. It's called pivoting, and you just get to cycle straight back to it. So you prevent your words from being taken out of context, or the reporter only repeating your most dramatic sentence, when you only give them the context that you want to give them. And that might feel a little weird. That might be a little like, oh, but I should absolutely try to answer that complicated question. No, like reporters do want you to repeat the most dramatic thing. They want you to say something outrageous so that they can lead with that for the 9 o'clock broadcast. Don't give it to them. Don't give it to them. Tell them your story and tell them your values and your message and your call to action. That's a great question. But what's really important here is maybe one of the most powerful framing devices when it comes to media relations. So don't be shy about that. Don't be shy about that. Hilly, can I have the next slide? Okay, so you've gotten coverage. What happens now? Like, what's your responsibility? Does anyone have any thoughts about like what should happen? Okay, here's the deal. Someone in, yes, share it. And John, I will come back to that. Thank you, like in closing. So share your story. If you see that and ask the reporter, once this is published, can you shoot me an email or a text, or like drop it to me in a private message, whatever, like a messenger pigeon, I don't care, whatever most convenient for them, because I want to share this and your work with the outside world. Yes, tag the reporter and the outlet on social, because that is how you will get more attention for it. It is your job as an advocate to make sure that all of this effort you've gone to does not go to waste. So make a plan, look at your social media and communications channels as an individual or as an organization. Decide which ones are most powerful in terms of like how many people are reached, how many people are actually engaging with it. That means like liking it, sharing it, like commenting on it, ideally. That's what matters. That's what matters. So make sure that you have a plan. Write a follow-up note to the reporter and say, like, I tagged you here, here, and here. Thank you so much for covering this. I'm really excited to work with you again in the future. Like, think about it as like this cycle of like potentially like really virtuous communication, where we get to treat each other with a little bit more respect, and where you show a little bit of deference and respect and admiration for someone's like professional skill set. Because journalism is a professional skill set. Citizen journalism is really important. We would not have Black Lives Matter as a movement if it wasn't for cell phone footage. We wouldn't. It wouldn't happen. We know that police departments have been acting with impunity when it comes to valuing the basic life of Black people in this country for a very long time, but it's only now that we get to see it happen in real time. So by no means do I want to discount the power of you and your camera being out in the street in a breaking news situation. But as an advocate, your job is to participate in the publishing cycle and to do so in a way that does right by you and does right by the organization or the cause that you're representing. And so once more, I want to go back to the fact that like you never have to answer a question that you don't want to, because you can always say, that's a great question, but what's really important here is XYZ, because that makes for a great clip, either like a soundbite or like the quote that gets pulled to the top of the story. What's really important here is that we want our neighborhood to be a little bit better. What's really important here is that people can take action for themselves. What's really important here is that we want the police department to be held accountable for its actions. Think about it like that, because what's really important here is actually the core of your messaging. So friends, that's what I've got, but I want to open it up if there are any other questions. And I'm also going to leave my contact info in the chat if you want to follow up with me. But I really want to say thank you to Action Tank, to Ioana for your leadership, and Hilly for all of your hard work, and for all of you for choosing to spend your evening with me. This is really special, and I'm really, really grateful to be a tiny part of Action Tank's work.
Thanks, Katie. You did better than any speaker we've had at reading questions in the chat while you were talking.
Well,
Absolutely true.
Hilly sharing the slides makes it wonderful. Team, I'm also going to put together just like a quick one-sheeter that I'll ask Hilly to share around with you, just like some of my main points. Another thought in terms of that I want to leave you with is that it is a-okay to have your notes. It's a-okay. And that's one of the ways in which you keep from rambling and are able to stay on message. So you don't have to memorize everything. We all learn differently. We all communicate differently. So don't be shy about saying, you know what, I actually need to write this down before I answer you, or I need to take a minute with that. That's totally acceptable, because once more, like, we are all approaching communication with our own skill sets and abilities. So be patient with yourself and don't be afraid to advocate for yourself in that situation. Yes, Erin, go Ramblers. Sister Jean is my girl. She's my girl. All right. it looks like people are just being really nice in the chat, Ioana. So I think we can kick it back over to you.
Good job. Let's give Katie a round of applause.
Thank you so much.
All right, I'm handing it over to Hilly again. She's going to introduce our next speaker.
Okay, so I see Destinee is here. Our next speaker is our arts partner, Destinee Thomas, who's going to lead us through a storytelling workshop. I'm gonna read a little bit about Destinee here. Destinee is the co-founder of community engagement collective Cincy Nice and founder of Destinee Sky Strategies, LLC. She works as a marketing and communication strategy independent contractor with recent roles as marketing manager for Blink 2019 and communications resident for People's Liberty. She previously worked supporting national storytelling efforts at Source Cincinnati and with nonprofit youth employment organization Artworks. She's a Cincinnati native and proud University of Miami graduate. Outside of work, she's involved as a member of the Cincinnati Memorial Hall Society. She resides in Walnut Hills with her fiance, Brett, and cat, Timmy. Are we gonna see Timmy?
There's always a chance you'll hear her. She doesn't usually show her face like really ever. She's about 15 years old, so she's an old lady. Should I just share my screen for this one, Hilly?
Sure.
Perfect. Let's
Make Destinee
Oh,
co-host.
I think I'm not co-host.
There we go.
One second here. Where's my, oh, there it is. All right, I should be in presentation mode. Thanks so much, Katie. It's fun to kind of tag team off of that because I think they go together hand in hand. And thanks so much for you guys for being here tonight. I'm just gonna start by saying, so this is the first time I've actually ever kind of done a presentation or workshop solely on storytelling. So feel free to hop in as I kind of go along. I realized as I was doing this that I think storytelling is very unique to each person's kind of skill set and how they approach it. So I think it'll be interesting to kind of have this as somewhat of a discussion on what's worked for you guys, what hasn't worked, where you've seen storytelling that's worked. It's kind of like an abstract a little bit. So I'll introduce myself. So my name's Destinee Thomas. I am the co-founder of Cincy Nice. It's been most of what I think about every single day at the moment. We are a creative collective. It's myself, my brother William Thomas, who started Mortar, and Peace, who is a member of Tribe, who also does a lot of activism work. And we really banded together to just kind of think of different ways to solve problems in the city. I am super passionate about community building. I am not going to be good at reading the chat box, but I would love to just hear what you guys are all passionate about. And if Hilly and you guys can help read it out. But I've been thinking just so much, especially with COVID-19, just about this idea of community building. And it's really been my conversation starter with people these days of just understanding how you're keeping yourself energized and moving forward during these crazy kind of COVID days. A little more background about myself. So I was born in Cincinnati to Barbara Jean Hunn and Bill Thomas. My dad's white, my mom's black. And being biracial has really, I think, been a thread line for me in terms of why community building and projects that bring people together are so important. It's kind of a skill that you learn when you navigate two worlds just starting out. I studied PR and political science at the University of Miami. I went there solely because it was warm. So I'm confused why I returned, especially these days, but I loved being down there. I loved the diversity. I came back to Cincinnati actually to work on the Obama campaign and never left. I ended up kind of starting my world in communications at a PR agency here in town, and did that for a long time. So a lot of media relations. I'm sure I sent Katie several pitches at some point along the way. So I'd be happy to talk about being on the other end of kind of landing stories and getting back into doing that now. I've worked in the community. I've really shifted to nonprofit. I loved working at Artworks. I love this idea of changing reputation and really started focusing on it with my work at Source Cincinnati. And it's something that I kind of still think about, but in terms now of how do we change the reputation of how we look at each other, how we look at each other as kind of citizens, and just being more understanding. I have been doing contract work, and I should have made a crazy squiggly line because most of that was Blink 2019. So if you guys came out and saw Blink, thank you. It was the craziest 6 months of my life as the only marketing person on the team. Amongst that, honestly, a little bit of vulnerable. I loved Blink, but really was frustrated with the lack of diversity within the event. And it's what sparked the foundation of Cincy Nice. And we launched that weekend with a house that was just devoted to bringing Black artists together and Black visitors in town. And we've been doing a lot of work since. I did not actually mean to make that line go like kind of crazy, but it felt right for these COVID days, so I left it. But yeah, and then the rest I'm just kind of figuring out along with everyone else. And I tell you those things, and then I'm going to also present something I think shares who I am a little bit more. So this is a video about probably the largest project that Cincy Nice has done. And this one's more of a story. So I think this is the biggest differentiator when I think of storytelling. The first thing, even though I told it in a storytelling fashion, was a series of events. And I think that storytelling really needs to include, yes, a series of events, but also the context around it, the who it's happening to, and how that person responds. So even though you can share your backstory, that does not change. It doesn't have a story arc. It doesn't have that lasting feeling. So this is not the best storytelling piece ever, but I think definitely gives you more of a feel of who I am. So I'm just going to play this really quickly.
All right, so my name is Destinee Thomas. I am one of the co-founders of Cincy Nice, who is organizing our tables. I also work as a marketing communications professional. Man, we're sitting here in the mortar courtyard because a week ago we were kind of introduced to this idea of like we should do something with this protest art. And the idea was a gallery, and it just didn't sit well with me, and it didn't feel like it was the right use of this art or even the right respect for what brought this art to be. And I was actually driving down the street with my boyfriend, and I was like, man, what if we could use these boards and just put them in the street and invite people to talk about them? And like we literally take back the narrative and cover like the street where you can't miss us, and say, no, this is what we want to talk about. This is why this art came up. This is why people were so angry that windows were broken. Yeah, so it's really, I mean, we decided I needed to take back the narrative, and it had to happen kind of urgently as the boards were coming down, and felt like the momentum was shifting. You know, there's room for you, no matter who you are. And it had this idea of the table, and that right now matters, but also every single thing that we do afterwards matters. And I think it spoke to me so much just because, man, I think that people are talking way too big. It's like you have to, here's $5 million for racial equality. And it starts with baby steps, it's like maybe come to a space that's mostly Black and see what it feels like to feel uncomfortable and be the minority. Maybe reach out to a Black friend and have an honest conversation. Maybe make a Black friend. Maybe visit a city that's more Black than the one you're used to. And I think it's like those smaller steps that can happen every second, every day, when you're conscious of how you're taking up space in the world, when you're conscious of how you say things. I think of things all the time that I need to shift, and
and do differently. And I think that's how change happens. It's not the $5 million pledge. It's each of us every single day making choices to do something differently to help everyone else around us.
Okay, so I am not the most eloquent person on camera. I'm not the most I'm really bad with like saying man or but I wanted to play that just to give you the idea of there is a big difference between just stating some facts and really bringing people into your how and what happened and how it goes on. So I want to kind of walk through how I've come to the point of feeling like I'm a storyteller, and it's not something, just to be kind of vulnerable, I would normally say, yes, I tell stories, but I do think it's a tool that I use often. And I think that you don't have to be a storyteller or work in the media or be an author. I think there's these places where people find themselves saying, oh, this is what a storyteller is. And I don't think that's that. I think that it's a tool that we use all the time to push a mission forward. Keep going. So yeah, let's talk about it. So my version of stories, and I would love to kind of hear what you guys think as well, is that it's kind of in this balance of what is this about and why should I care? And I think sometimes we end up falling with what is this about? So that's like your who, what, when, where, and that's where it stops. And that's, yes, facts, and I guess it could be written as a story, but it's not getting the full balance of it. So it's also why should I care? And the ways that I often use storytelling is either to get someone to imagine larger with me, or to back up an argument that I have. So even if I am pitching the media and it's, you know, there's a girl in my street who has walked out every day and shoveled, you know, our neighbor's yard, and it's a great story in terms of, you know, how the neighbors are coming together. It's like, this is what's happening, here's who's doing it, and also why they should care. And it helps put the whole package together. Yeah, Katie, please feel free to hop in if I'm not doing that well. But I use it really just to help people understand where I'm coming from, but also just to take it one step further and really start to build trust. Because I think there's lots of times, especially with media, where it becomes very transactional. And I think that comes from working on the PR side, where you're pitching people all the time, and no one wants to feel like just a transaction. They want to feel like they're part of the story that you're building, and they want to feel like they're part of your why as well. So it's, you know, if it is the media reporter who you're like, I've seen that you care that neighbors help neighbors, I saw a great example of it, then we're starting to connect on like a values level, much more than just, can you share the story because I represent, I don't know, Walnut Hills, which, you know, I mean, maybe, but I don't think it's gonna build the relationship. So I feel like they always say tales as old as time, and it's totally true. And I think it goes back to this idea of anyone can be a storyteller. People have been telling stories since as long as we could figure out how to draw and write. I think it's kind of interesting that there's kind of these main themes that are always part of a story. And I think there's probably some deeper, I am not a story anthropologist or anything like that, but there are themes that are pretty universal. It's, you know, you're going to go out and beat the bad guy, whether that be Wall Street or whoever it is, but it's kind of like that underdog story of this guy has to go out and tackle it. There's like the rags to riches story, which is like Serena Williams. That's why her story resonates so well. She started in Compton, and then this happened, and then that happened, and look where she's gotten to. There's like the great journey, you know, you think of the Odyssey. The comedy, I think it's not usually funny. It's usually like the rom-com type thing of like these two people just can't seem to get on the same page, all those type of pieces. But they're themes that you've recognized. And I think they're universal because they all still tie into something that we can relate to. You can relate to being the underdog. You can feel what it could feel like to be the underdog. You know what it feels like to be at your job and you have to go to present to your boss that's evil and you're not sure how you're going to do it. Like all those things are human feelings that are inside there. And I think that's why these kind of themes have continued into forevermore and continue to reappear. That said, your audience is not universal. And knowing your audience and what makes them unique is just as much an important part of figuring out how you're going to tell a story. So there's some key questions that I usually try and ask myself. And I think it's hard, honestly, to not stereotype, because I think that's kind of how you learn it in marketing. It's like, I don't know, the typical example would be like, Sally is a wealthy woman who lives in the suburb, write out her whole thing. And then you go through this exercise and you're like, Sally probably has one kid and her husband works at a bank, and it's kind of silly. I try and do it more so if I'm in Sally's shoes and I already know the story and what I'm trying to convince her. So if I want Sally to care more about supporting the school tax, you should just care about how Sally cares about her kids. Like, you know, there's certain thread lines. If we both have kids, let's figure out, like, Sally goes to the park the same way I go to the park. Sally, so she cares about green spaces. She cares about spending quality time with her kids. It's like, I think it's dialing into exactly, who they are, and kind of building some stereotype kind of pieces, but really like standing in their shoes and saying, okay, why is she kind of making those decisions? Could there be other things that I haven't considered on her side? And I think that's like as much of an important part as you start thinking about your story as the story itself. You know, you guys all care about what's happening in the city. I wouldn't come on here and give a bunch of examples about Ted Cruz and his care and support for everyone around him. You know, like you change your story based on, or I don't know, you guys could, I had to read all the Ted Cruz stuff today. But it's just like understanding who your audience is and a little bit of reading that room, but also doing the prep work to really put some thought and reflection into how your story will be perceived and also received by the other person. But I just want to get back to the full theme. Really, everything storytelling is about human connection. And I always think about, it's like the most true quote ever for so many different things, but it's, you know, people will always forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And I think that's kind of that difference between here's a series of events and here's a story that kind of lasts with you a little bit longer than your regular kind of presentation or whatever it is. So I have come up with some of my own personal storytelling philosophies, and I will say that most of these I never realized were philosophies until I started thinking about this workshop. So I say use with discretion because they are all within a balance. So I'll start. So number one, don't take yourself too seriously, ever. But do be very serious about what you care about. And thinking through this one, it's like, I feel like there's the person who gets ready for a speech and you know them to be a very authentic person, a very warm person, and then they prepare their speech like it's a TED Talk and they have all their points and it is very polished. They've scrubbed away any sort of the conflict or the tension, and it's just a really well-written, beautiful speech, but it does not, you know, the points may all be there. It might technically be a very good story, but it doesn't connect with you. And I think that happens often when people decide that they're going to get in front of the media for the first time, or that they're going to become activists, and they start to forget how they normally talk. And I don't want anyone to do that. So I always remind myself, I'll find myself saying things like, you know, upon further review, it's like, that's not ever how I talk. So why am I suddenly letting that come out of my mouth? So it's like that part of like, all of a sudden, you know, someone is paying you to do a speech, you morph into another person. And you don't want to do that. I think the most they're the best storytelling happens when you keep the humanness in it, which is that there's conflict as a human, there's failure as a human, there is innately something that you failed at and that you wish you did differently. There are parts of you that are super unpolished, and just owning up to that and having that be part of it. If I could talk to Joe Biden, I would tell him that maybe he should let his stutter come out sometimes, where it's more uncomfortable when you can tell he's holding it back than just being like, okay, I still am struggling with a stutter. I don't know how to, if anyone knows his communications people, let me know. But I think there's those pieces of yourself that all of a sudden, when someone tells you have to go tell a story or you have to present that, whether consciously or unconsciously, you end up kind of scrubbing over. And I think the important part about that is there is a level of trust when you start telling a story. And if you lose some of your if it's too polished, or if suddenly your journey from Serena Williams in Compton to being a world tennis star doesn't include some of those bumps along the way, then you're no longer believable. So you have to stay trustworthy. And I think a big part of that is like, yes, be serious. Present yourself as a serious person, because you do want to be trusted. But don't lose some of that, just some of that humanness. I was trying to read the chat at once. I'm really bad at it. What are some of the main points of storytelling? Is that the question, John?
I don't know.
No? Okay, fine. Okay. I just don't know where we would move it to. Somewhere. Like 4 feet away? I know. I was gonna look.
I think the main points of storytelling is always like there's a person, there's a problem, there's a way of solving it, and then there's kind of like what you learned along the way. But I think that also comes in so many different versions. So I don't think there's one way of storytelling or there's one piece, but I think there's always that like humanness of like, there is a journey. There's who's in it, what are they up against, how are they gonna solve it, how are they gonna deal with it, and then what did they learn? Is usually how I kind of start framing up a story. Okay, this one is one that I am guilty of all the time. Yes, you have a message, that's why you're here. Definitely plan to preach on it, but don't turn into, I always think of like, I sound like my mom when she's mad at me, and that I never listened once she started, preaching at me about whatever. My ears suddenly would be closed. And it's a very thin line, I think, between feeling preachy and feeling like this is what I care about and why I care. And I think that's where storytelling helps. So if my niece is 17, she hates COVID. She's been trapped in her house forever. She's starting to just be extra 17 and bratty. I'm trying to talk to her about like, still be nice to your mom. Like, how do you, and I could hear myself just saying, why don't you just be nicer? It's, we're all going through this, instead of saying when I was 17, this was what was frustrating to me. This is what I did wrong. I was totally a jerk, to grandma. This is what I was feeling. Maybe there's some other ways that we could do it. And like, I can feel how that feels differently, but it's also very, very hard to do. And to not get in that trap of like, what matters to you. For example, wear a mask. You should wear a mask. Everyone should be wearing masks. It's no longer resonating with people. But if I can stand in front of someone and say, I worked in a volunteer voting campaign situation. We opened a mutual aid center. A lot of the people that we served did not wear masks. I ended up upgrading all the way back in October to an N95. It was definitely dangerous. We tried to have the conversations about it, but ultimately, because I was wearing an N95 and everyone else in our staff was, none of us ended up getting COVID. I think, maybe it worked. Like, what's been your experience? How did that go for you? And I think that's an easier way to have that conversation than, oh my gosh, no one's wearing a mask. Everyone should be wearing masks. COVID's still out there. Like it's that shift in how you're going to approach it, and finding some concrete kind of ways that open up more of a discussion, or definitely kind of that be more message driven kind of piece. So, also a challenging one. So like I said, these are philosophies that I believe in, but don't always have a easy time practicing. I think sometimes when we get ready to tell a story, we think of so many things that would elaborate on it or that would add detail, but that ultimately are not relevant and do not matter to our audience. And I think it's especially easy if you get in front of a TV person, or you're in the heat of a moment at a protest or whatever it may be, to start adding in things that don't fully matter to your audience. And I think this one is a big one. I know you talked about notes, Katie, of having like, what are your 3 points, the most important details that you need to get across? The people here don't have a paycheck right now. They haven't had a paycheck since this time. And because of that, those are the 3 key details you need to have. If there are other details that are along there that they've been working for 6 months in a storefront, that's cold. Like maybe it matters ultimately to you. It doesn't matter for your recipient of the audience. They need a couple key points. They need them really tight. And they just don't need as much of the other fluff. And I think it's one of those things that as you keep practicing it, but if you're alert to it, you can find it before you get to rambling as you're giving a speech. And I've tried, so this is like the harder one, but I've tried to really start planning out the other side of the details as well. So if you are, giving a story, and it's part of knowing your audience, it's what are they thinking are the important details, and having kind of that pre-planned response, and sometimes even included in your story. It's like, I understand that everyone is having a hard time earning a paycheck right now, but this is important to us because of these things. So it's like you're preemptively kind of including what they're going to say, and relating to them, but also still sticking to what your main 3 messages are so that they're in there at the end. Okay, this is a little bit similar to kind of the TED Talk feel. But I'm trying to think of like the best example. So I don't have as good of an example for this one, but I think this is something that always happens is you plan ahead for giving a story, and you try to, polish out some of those ways that you naturally talk, that you naturally would maybe like relate to people. It's like almost like the wink or some of those like little things that you suddenly forget to include in your storytelling process. So I just, again, certainly practice, but don't forget who you are in that piece of it. And this is like my big kind of, as a PR person, everyone can truly be a storyteller, but not everyone should be your storyteller. So the messenger matters. It always matters. And there are lots of times when it's not your story to tell, or when there is a better person to be presenting on your behalf. So, I mean, think of if you are planning you have the opportunity, WCPO has called you, you're going to get a chance to tell them about the project that you worked on. You think it's done a great job. It's made all this impact. Maybe you should tell it, or maybe you should have the person that it's impacted the most be the one that's speaking on your behalf, and really thinking about who can best be trusted to hear that story, and who best will resonate with who else is telling it. And I think this has been a lesson that I've learned a lot over the last year, and working with different groups. I've done some work with Siriamani. You may have heard she does a lot of activism type work. And I could say something and I would not be trusted because I have not put in the work amongst some of the people that are in the streets, amongst some of the other activist groups. It doesn't work coming from me because I haven't built those relationships yet, or quite frankly, I might be able to get the key points together and write it, but I might not be able to tell that story authentically. So I think it's really, really putting in the thought process of who can be the right person to convey that story. And I think the biggest thing, so one of the projects we did for Cincy Nice, we opened a headquarters on Vine Street, just to help get out kind of some of the voter registration questions that people had. And we really did it because we were talking to people and they felt like they could not get the right information on sending in their mail-in ballots. And it just became, who's the right person to sit at the front desk where people actually stop, hear any of that information, ask the questions, not feel like they'll be judged. We had so many people that came up and told us, I've never voted before, and like a whisper. People that you would have thought would have voted, but they knew that there was a recipient on the other side and they could have the conversation. So I think that it's like thinking about storytelling, not just like who's in front of the TV or doing the interview, but also each kind of touch point of where a story or a message is being transferred, and thinking through who can you prep and put the right person there to be representing that story that you want to have. And like the story that I wanted was, it's important to vote. So I don't care who's, the right person to say it. But I wanted it to be said. So we did a lot of thought around who's the right person to be sharing that message. And very, very similar to this. So it does not matter if it's the greatest story in the world. If you don't look the part, if you are sharing it on Twitter and everyone else is on Instagram, if you're saying that, everyone should have a livable wage and you are at the top floor of Fifth Third Bank and you're in a suit, no one's going to listen. It's like all of those things are sending messages. And I think there are many, many times when you work so hard on the story that you forget about all the other elements that are also conveying pieces of that story. And I can't do two things at once. I'm sorry, I was trying to read a message. I think this is one lesson that I've learned many, many, many times in working in PR, more so than anything else, that I've gotten the pitch. We have the person coming out and the media person saying, what's the backdrop? What's the, who's wearing a shirt? It's like, I don't want to be representing someone who's working in a food bank and you come down in a suit and tie. Like that conveys a whole different message. Even if the story is right, we've lost half the trust of the people that are viewing it. So just be considerate of all the different messages. If it's a fun story and you're trying to enjoy it, where's the music that's going with it? Is there other people that you need behind you? Just kind of ticking each one of those boxes, even as you're crafting your story. This one, I think, is what happens often in politics. We're both from the South, therefore we should care about this together. Yeah, maybe, but maybe not. It feels like pandering. And there's like a slippery slope of what's pandering and what's being genuine. And just to give you another example of a project I've been working on, we created, again, just out of this need to community build, this project called Soul Plates. And the idea was that everyone has some version of soul food. So I am a Black person. I enjoy soul food to mean, my grandma's cooking. But then we kind of extended it to mean everyone has some sort of food that touches their soul. And we've been able to, through that message, have all these other conversations, never strain from, I have experienced life as a Black person, and my version of, soul food is, green beans and sweet potatoes. But now I'm talking to someone from Northern India, and he's talking about his grandma also cooking, except for what she was cooking was, rice and some sort of curry. But we were able to still have a conversation that I think really, it was telling stories, it was finding ways that we were similar, but also finding ways that we were very much uniquely ourselves. And I think the tendency is to just quickly kind of go over to like, here's this thing about us that is one and the same, and now kind of diving into it to actually learn more about who each other are. So always, always, always be yourself. People are going to trust you more. I think people will be more forgiving always if you are like, I would love to learn about Indian food, but I've only had this type of experience, and like openly sharing that as part of your story, at least for me, has been able to afford so many other kind of outlets into other pieces of sharing my story. Okay, I've talked a lot too, so please keep, if you guys have questions. This is one that I am also very, very, very guilty of. And it's like the simple kind of quick fix to finding commonality where you're like, man, the snow sucks. Yes, we have that in common. We can both talk about how much it's cold outside, but it's not a long lasting connection. And this is all about forging connections. So I think it's an entryway in. Yeah, the snow sucks, but last Christmas I was able to escape, and before the pandemic, I actually went down to Colombia, and it was so incredible that I learned that they do these things the same. And it's like, have you had that experience? Have you traveled to somewhere else? It's like, I think there's an opportunity when we're telling stories to definitely connect on things that we dislike, because it's an easy way to quickly build a connection. But I would challenge all of us to not stay in the misery, because I don't think it creates the longer lasting relationships that you're hoping for. So I always try to kind of shift that to whatever it is. Yes, let's commiserate together, and then lean towards what are my hopes, my wishes, my ideas, and not stick with, this is what I don't like that the city is doing. This is what I wish the city would do differently. What do you wish? What would you hope to see? And it's honestly challenging, especially when you're working in activism type work, or when you're honed in on something that is negatively impacting the community. But at least in my experience, as long as you're always shifting towards like the future vision, you gain more followers. And that's really the goal always, is, build your coalition, motivate people to take action. And misery might attract them because they feel the same way, but it won't drive people into action usually, or at least I hope to think more towards the positive. This one, I don't know, maybe it's not universal, but for the most part, none of us are funny. There are very few people that are really funny, and when you're telling stories, I wouldn't try to be funny. It's like my overarching recommendation, unless someone is like, that is the funniest story I've ever heard, you should always tell that funny story this way, I probably wouldn't tell that story, and I especially wouldn't tell it in front of media or on Twitter, on social media, or anywhere where it has not been tried and true. I wish I were funnier. I wish I had funnier stories. I just don't. I'm not funny. It's a very high skill set to be a comedian, and they're usually miserable too, and they're usually actually talking about misery. So maybe no one's really that funny. And then these are kind of just like things I live by. Everyone can tell if you're phony, always. We've all felt it, we've seen it. It's easy when you're passionate about something to accidentally do some of these things, but don't, especially not in 2021 when pretty much every single thing we do is recorded. So if you don't mean it, don't say it. If you don't believe in it, they'll be able to tell, don't say it. Only talk about what you truly believe in. Only talk about what you're truly excited by. To Katie's point earlier, you don't have to answer. You can always go towards, yeah, okay, they said that, but you know, another example, I did do some work around trying to get voter turnout, like build some excitement about voter turnout. I forget which station it is, stopped by our little like pop-up headquarters, and it was the night before the election. I was exhausted. I did not even want to speak to them. I don't know how they found us. And I was like, fine, okay. Night before election, I'll come out and talk and do a quick interview. He promised me it would not be about election day anxiety and people rioting. And as soon as the camera turned on, he said, "Are you concerned that people are going to riot?" And I was caught off guard. I don't think I actually did as good of a job of like not answering it, but I think it was this idea of saying, you know, I believe that people are good and that we're going to hopefully look towards tomorrow as a new day, and that, you know, the election process works. And it's like, you don't have to lean into something that you don't believe. I didn't believe that people were going to riot. I don't want to be on TV around the topic. And so I didn't, you don't have to. I think there's lots of times where you get trapped into these situations of feeling like, you know, now you have a platform and all of a sudden I feel like I have to be overly ambitious about, I think 100,000 people are going to come out. You don't have to say that. No one's making you say that. I think it's just like really stick to what you think is true and what you know to be true, and that's it. Like it's a tricky thing that happens as soon as a camera turns on, or as soon as you feel like you have people in front of you where you want to it's like human nature to overpromise, to want to make yourself look better, to just to be this version of yourself that you're not. So it's like one of those things I kind of pin up to myself. It's like, if it's not true, if I don't mean it, if I'm not excited about it, it's not for me to say, and to keep going. Oops. Okay, I just talked so much and gave so many examples. So I just want to pause for a second and just say, any reactions to what are probably some kind of bold statements in terms of how to storytell, and maybe not exactly what you thought a storytelling workshop would be. And just generally, as some of you guys have told stories, everyone has told stories in some form or fashion during their work, but just any things that have worked for you or haven't, or where you found yourself kind of in that same situation.
If anyone wants to put questions in the chat, if they don't want to unmute themselves and read them, we'll read them for you.
Absolutely. And then I just also want to tell you guys, so I was planning to wrap this up. Is everyone taking a couple of minutes to really think about, with all the things that we talked about, thinking about sharing your story of like what inspires you to action, and keeping it really, really tight. So no pressure to like read it out loud, but I would take just a couple of minutes to think about, you know, being your truest self, really understanding like what those most important details are, and helping people understand why it matters to you. It has to be like beyond just people need help. Why do you feel so passionately about that? What is the why in there? And just to help, so this is something that I also have, that I keep when I'm like really, really quickly need to come up with, you know, what is this and why? So someone calls you and it's like, you know, yesterday I had a last minute Zoom interview with WCPO, and I didn't realize we were recording yet. And then all of a sudden she was like, yeah, okay, go, like, what is Soul Plates? And I was like, oh, okay. And it needed like a very quick sentence. And I think I always come back to this, like, we created Soul Plates for this so that people could come together. And it's like the one that I just like always have kind of in the back of my head, for anything that people ask me, like, why are you in communication? Because I think it's important to find different ways to bring people together. It's like there's always a to this, to that, that translates really quickly when you're in a pinch. But I'll go back to that piece. I guess I should try and do it too. I didn't even think about it, but I should probably go for it. I don't know if.
Do you want me to set a timer, Destinee?
Sure. And
Okay, I'm doing
I'll
it.
take out my pen too.
All right, guys, 120 seconds starting now. I think that's time. I realized that I accidentally set my timer for 2 hours instead of 2 minutes. So I'm just guessing. People put some good stuff in the chat.
Yeah. And Katie, I saw you had one. I don't know if you want to read it out loud.
Sure. I also realized that I forgot my why, so I added that in the end. But I'm inspired by the power of my neighbors and a shovel and a cup of salt to create a neighborhood where we can all walk regardless of ability and where we can all approach winter without a sense of shame or blame. I don't own a car, and being a pedestrian is a core part of who I am. And I want everyone to feel respected regardless of their mobility or choice of transportation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like someone heard something about you. I think mine I sort of wrote, but then I started reading comments. But I think I have this deep feeling of I hate seeing people feel unwelcomed. And I think it comes from growing up biracial and also seeing how one side of my family was treated, the other side was treated, and just like those disconnects my whole life. And I have just a kind of like gut uncomfortability when I feel like someone's not being welcome in. So I'm just trying to make things more welcoming and create spaces where that happens. Let's see, Robbie shared one, the desire to create positive change in the lives of people through guiding them to see their value in society. It's time to give back using my knowledge and experiences to do more. Yeah, Robbie, I would just say like, what is it about your experiences? Like what has happened that you've been able to see that like there is positive change to be created?
I guess I've been very fortunate in what I've been able to accomplish. I'm older and I feel that I need to take what I've learned and help people through volunteer work in the many different organizations I volunteer, because the biggest single thing is the fact we all are in this together at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. There you go. Let's see, Tina, you're saying the possibility of creating and sharing visual storytelling that was healing for the community and individuals and myself. Are you a visual storyteller? I don't think I've seen your name before actually, Tina, so I'm interested in.
I'm a photographer.
Photographer. How did you get into photography?
Oh gosh, how did I get into photography? That's a long story. That's a whole nother story. Just probably originally having bad pictures of myself taken and thinking I could just do better, or understanding what it's like to live with something and think that your image represents you when really it looks nothing like you. And hearing that from my friends, and then being able to say, okay, like, well, how can we change that? How can we make this camera do what our eyes say?
Uh-huh.
And that it's only a tool from here to the final image, and it isn't the truth, and it isn't accurate.
Mm-hmm.
How do we portray it from a truthful viewpoint?
It's beautiful. I see. I feel like that was the piece that was missing. It's there's always a kind of behind the scenes story that I think I can understand having my photo taken and not liking what I'm seeing. So you know, wanting to help people.
And then actually, you know, the bigger story for me is like I guess my mission as a photographer is about ending racism. And it's also a sort of a journey to who am I and my cultural heritage, which is very, very mixed.
Mm-hmm.
And what can I do to share, to help end racism? That's, I mean, that really is the bottom line.
Yeah. I see, Kimberly, you said you're inspired to use my resiliency to provide it for others on our journey for equity and justice. I would just say, how did you build up so much resiliency?
Just life's experiences. So I think with age comes wisdom and resilience. I mean, the more information you can bring in about how to navigate the bumps, mm-hmm. Creates resilience.
How have you been able to kind of help someone else see that?
Sharing what I know, sharing what I've learned along the road. You know, I have a daughter. She's 28, and I've taught her so much, and she credits her resilience to what I was able to teach her. Mm-hmm. And by the way, ultimately, I'm inspired by my daughter for everything.
Oh, it's beautiful. And I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to.
Yeah.
I learned so much from my mom in terms of how she's been able to kind of overcome so many different things. And I can't imagine being a woman back then. So even that alone is pretty inspiring. But I think it's those like little tidbits of how we all have like these thread lines that we can envision. It's like you can envision you sharing that wisdom with your daughter, and it's like that's the piece that you really feel like, oh, I understand Kimberly better. I understand why she's sharing this better. So it's like always kind of like digging a little bit deeper and a little bit more vulnerable, I would say, to really help people understand who you are and why you're doing what you're doing in the end.
And, you know, I have found that vulnerability is a strength. It's not a weakness.
Absolutely.
And I think that it contributes to resiliency.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. I don't know if anyone has any other questions, but I really, really appreciate you guys listening to me and being part of tonight and really caring about what happens in the world, ultimately. It's beautiful.
If anybody has any final questions, they can feel free to be brave and unmute themselves.
Contact information for both of our speakers, please.
Yeah, if you guys are willing to drop your work emails in the chat, go for it. Destinee, thank you so much for your presentation. You had the most beautiful slides I've ever seen. Most beautiful PowerPoint presentation ever.
You really spun our template into gold, so thanks for that.
And obviously listening to examples of your work was really inspiring too. The substance was good. The form was beautiful as well though. Hilly, do you want to describe the like optional extra credit work?
Sure. So
great.
Just to acknowledge a couple of notes in the chat, we will be sending out information and slides to the participants from tonight later. And we will be putting the recording of this session up on our website tomorrow. So I know some people were wondering about that. We do want to introduce here at the very end, we want to introduce a concept that we are working on with Action Tank. We are going to have some candidate nights coming up where we have, we invite mayoral and council candidates to come kind of lead like participate in an artistic forum compared to typical question and answer forums. And we are seeking your participation in that. And I'm just gonna pop something up on the screen real quick to show you. You can see this. So we will be sending out more information about this in emails that we send out after the class also. But we are inviting Action Tank participants, night school participants, to express yourselves artistically in any form that makes you feel comfortable, in any form that speaks to you. Whether that be drawing, painting, storytelling, video, music, cooking, photography, to answer one of these three prompts on the screen here. What is broken about Cincinnati? What should our local government leaders prioritize? And what is your hope for Cincinnati? And I will be sending this out, these prompts. We are looking to collect as many pieces of art from you guys as possible throughout the rest of February and all of March. So that's just some food for thought that we want to introduce. you want to say
And then
anything?
we'll feature them and give you credit at the candidate nights when we ask questions based on the art that you generate. Cool. Should we have one last round of applause for our speakers, Katie and Destinee? Yay!
Thank you so much to Katie and Destinee. You guys really were fantastic.
Okay.
And
Have a great night.